friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 11 of our read along together of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Today, once again, we're just going to read one chapter, but as usual, it will be a great chapter. Let's go ahead and get started with some tea. The tea I'm enjoying today is one I've had before. It's an herbal tea by Twinings. It's a buttermint. It's described, they say, dare to resist the smooth, creamy taste of this vanilla-flavored peppermint tea. It is pretty darn good. I don't know if I dare to resist it. I don't see any point in trying. It's just good. Why not enjoy it? So this one is my buttermint tea. So just a peppermint tea with a tinge of vanilla. Yeah, definitely more pepperminty, but wow. The scent is definitely peppermint, and then when you actually taste it, you do get the vanilla also. That's a nice blend. Really good. Okay, so let's start by talking a little bit about what we read yesterday, and of course, one final reminder, if you have not yet RSVP'd that you are going to our tea party next week, but you're planning on going, please go ahead and RSVP. The reason to do it is so that way I have time to send a packet of tea over to the nearest branch to you. So if you're still not sure if you're going to go, you can say you're interested. But if you're in the interested category and you really are pretty sure you're going to go, RSVP now, because after the reading, I'm going to go ahead and see who else is going. If there's anyone else, I'll go ahead and send the tea out to your branch. Otherwise, there probably won't be time to get it out to your library in time for you to be able to pick it up and participate with the same tea. You're still welcome to come in and join us next week after that. It just, I won't have time to be able to send the free tea to you, which I think is kind of a fun part of it. So that's if you want to participate in the Count of Monte Cristo Tea Party, which will be held on May the 21st at 10:30 a.m. Again, as I said before, per the instructions of Alexander Dumas when he was talking about the breakfast get-together between the Count of Monte Cristo and Albert de Morcerf. So if we're going to follow in that tradition, then we're going to need to have our tea party next Friday, the 21st at 10:30 a.m. But let's talk a little bit about Wuthering Heights, which we read 3 chapters of yesterday. We read chapters 18 through 20. And started out with 12 years passing in a blur, and Ellen Dean saying how young Miss Linton, Catherine, or Cathy, as she's called by her family, just to make it even more confusing as to which Cathy or Catherine Linton we're talking about. It's the daughter, Cathy number 2, that she is a lovely young lady. She has the spirit of her mother, but she is gentler and kinder. So again, like her mother and her father, she is, as she's getting older, she wants to go explore a little bit more, but her father has kept her close at Thrushcross Grange. He hasn't taken her out very far. Specifically, he's never taken her in the direction of Wuthering Heights. Doesn't want her to go over there and meet those people. And so, but she keeps asking. She wants to see Penistone Crag. She can see it in the distance and she wants to visit, but it passes too close to Wuthering Heights. So Ellen and her father have both discouraged her very much. Finally, something changes when she is a little over 12, just, she gets a notification, she's almost 13, that the family is notified that Isabella Linton Heathcliff is dying, and that she, her health has always been kind of poor, and she's dying, and she asks her brother Edgar to come visit her to take over guardianship of her son, Linton Heathcliff. And so Edgar actually leaves Thrushcross Grange for the first major visit trip away that he's had since his wife, Catherine Earnshaw Linton, Cathy 1, died so many years before. He's gone for 3 weeks, and while he's gone, he charges Ellen to make sure to watch Cathy, the daughter, to make sure she doesn't wander. And Cathy one day does indeed wander. And when Ellen goes looking for her, she finds that she has gone to Wuthering Heights, of course. She had actually gone to Penistone Crags, and she had, on the way, she'd passed by Wuthering Heights, and Hareton Earnshaw had agreed to help her and to be her guide. Their dogs had had a little fight with each other. His dogs had bit her dogs. But then they'd made up, and he'd gone and he'd shown her the sights of Penistone Crags, and then they'd gone back to Wuthering Heights, and so they were just sitting around hanging out when Ellen showed up. And it gets a little weird because she starts treating him like a servant a little bit because, you know, she doesn't know that it was his family that had owned that estate, and in fact that he is her cousin, because he just looks like a servant. Once she finds out that he's not the son of Mr. Heathcliff, the owner, she just assumes he's a servant, and he gets quite offended. But again, he's in that sort of nebulous state where his family had owned the estate, but his father lost it to Mr. Heathcliff. And so then the maid servant there, it might be Zillah, the housekeeper that we meet later on, or it might be somebody else, I'm not quite sure. They don't name her in this scene. She says, well, you know, he's actually your cousin. You shouldn't talk to him like that. He's not just a servant. And Cathy's like, what? That being my cousin? And, you know, so he gets even more offended. Eventually, she does end up going back to Thrushcross Grange with Ellen, and she agrees not to tell the secret of having gone out there because Ellen says, you know, your father's gonna be really upset that you went out there. You know, you're not supposed to wander. He's gonna get mad at me. I might lose my job. And Cathy's like, no, I don't want that to happen to you. I don't want you to be punished. And so she does not tell. The next chapter, chapter 19, is an announcement from the father, Edgar, saying that her aunt, Isabella Linton Heathcliff, her, you know, Edgar's sister, has passed away, and that he's going to be returning, and he's bringing his nephew, Linton Heathcliff, who is 6 months younger than young Cathy. And so she's excited to get to meet her young cousin. And when the father comes back, we find that the boy he looks very much like a Linton. He's very fair and pale, unlike Heathcliff with that jet black hair and dark eyes. He's very fair and pale, but he's also rather weak. He looks kind of, he just looks a little sickly and a bit peevish also. And it's interesting too because he's just a little bit spoiled. So it's an interesting kid. Cathy is quite taken with him though, and she sort of like wants to pet him, like treat him like a doll, like a little pet of hers, and they seem to be getting along really well. And then basically it's like, well, it's time to go to bed. It's been a late night, so they're getting ready to send the children to bed. And then there's a guest at the house, and that guest is Joseph from Wuthering Heights, the servant. And he says, I've been charged by my master to pick up his son. And again, they'd heard about the son because when Cathy had been told that Hareton was her cousin, she's like, what? That's not my cousin. My dad is getting my cousin right now. And that's how the folks at Wuthering Heights, if they didn't know before, they sure knew then that Linton Heathcliff was coming back to the neighborhood. And so Joseph says, well, fine, if you're going to kick me out without him, because Edgar says, you know, you can't take him tonight, but we'll send him over tomorrow. And he's like, all right, you better send him. If not, I'm sending over the master. I'm sending over Heathcliff, and you're not going to kick him out. And indeed, Edgar Linton doesn't want to deal with Heathcliff coming back to the estate. So the following morning in chapter 20, he sends Nellie home to Wuthering Heights bearing Linton Heathcliff, the child. And Linton is sort of like, well, wait, that's my father? Why did I never hear about my father? And she's like, well, maybe your mother didn't want you to rather be with your father, so she didn't tell you about him. And it's like, but she told about my uncle. It's like, it's a different thing. And so Nellie's trying not to say the truth, which is that his parents hated each other, that Heathcliff's a horrible person, you know, because Linton's got to go live with Heathcliff, and let's hope that maybe it can go not terribly. And so it's an interesting scene. Heathcliff, when he sees Linton, is just like, ugh, he's horrible. He looks so much like them. And so it's an interesting thing, but Heathcliff he assures Nellie he's not going to hurt the child, and that if anything, he has plans for him, and, you know, he is going to, he has plans. He says, I'll be very kind to him. And he says, let me see if he actually says his plan. He says, my son is prospective owner of your place because Edgar Linton didn't have a male heir. And so the child, his son could conceivably inherit both Heathcliff's estate of Wuthering Heights, but also Edgar Linton's estate of Thrushcross Grange. He also says he's mine, and I want the triumph of seeing my descendant fairly lord of their estates, my child hiring their children to till their father's lands for wages. That is the sole consideration which can make me endure the whelp. I despise him for himself and hate him for the memories he revives, but that consideration is sufficient. He's as safe with me and shall be tended as carefully as your master tends his own. And so, yeah, Heathcliff assures Nellie that even though he does not like or respect Linton initially, that he has plans for him and he will care for him. Although he does say, it's interesting too, I've ordered Hareton to obey him, and in fact I've arranged everything with a view to preserve the superior and the gentleman in him above his associates. I do regret, however, that he so little deserves the trouble. If I wished any blessing in the world, it was to find him a worthy object of pride, and I'm bitterly disappointed with the whey-faced, whining wretch. And so Heathcliff clearly sees that his son is not like him at all. But he is his son, and he wants him to be esteemed. And so he's going to raise him to feel and to act superior to the others in the area. And so that is how the chapter ends, other than with Nellie leaving young Linton, like saying, no, I don't want to be left here. Don't leave me. I'll not stay here. I'll not stay here. But boom, door gets shut and locked, and he has to stay there. So that is the end of where we left off yesterday. Today we'll continue and find out what happens after Linton gets left behind at Wuthering Heights with his father. As I said, we're just going to read one chapter today, chapter 11, and let's go ahead and find out what happens. Chapter 21, day 11. We had sad work with little Cathy that day. She rose in high glee, eager to join her cousin, and such passionate tears and lamentations followed the news of his departure that Edgar himself was obliged to soothe her by affirming he should come back soon. He added, however, if I can get him, and there were no hopes of that. This promise poorly pacified her, but time was more potent, and though still at intervals she inquired of her father when Linton would return, before she did see him again his features had waxed so dim in her memory that she did not recognize him. When I chanced to encounter the housekeeper of Wuthering Heights in paying business visits to Gimmerton, I used to ask how the young master got on, for he lived almost as secluded as Catherine herself, and was never to be seen. I could gather from her that he continued in weak health, and was a tiresome inmate. She said Mr. Heathcliff seemed to dislike him ever longer and worse, though he took some trouble to conceal it. He had an antipathy to the sound of his voice, and could not do it all with his sitting in the same room with him many minutes together. There seldom passed much talk between them. Linton learnt his lessons and spent his evenings in a small apartment they called the parlor, or else lay in bed all day, for he was constantly getting coughs and colds and aches and pains of some sort. And I never knew such a faint-hearted creature, added the woman, nor one so careful of his helm. He will go on if I leave the window open a bit late in the evening. Oh, it's killing a breath of night air. And he must have a fire in the middle of summer, and Joseph's bacca pipe is poison, and he must always have sweets and dainties, and always milk, milk forever, heeding not how the rest of us are pinched in winter. And there he'll sit, wrapped in his furred cloak in his chair by the fire, and some toast or water or other slop on the hob to sip at. And if Hareton, for pity, comes to amuse him, Hareton is not bad-natured, though he's rough. They're sure to part, one swearing and the other crying. I believe the master would relish Earnshaw's thrashing him to a mummy if he were not his son, and I'm certain he would be fit to turn him out of doors if he knew half the nursing he gives himself. But then he won't go into danger of temptation. He never enters the parlor, and should Linton show those ways in the house where he is, he sends him upstairs directly. I divined from this account that utter lack of sympathy had rendered young Heathcliff selfish and disagreeable, if he were not so originally, and my interest in him, consequently, decayed. Though still I was moved with a sense of grief at his lot, and a wish that he had been left with us. Mr. Edgar encouraged me to gain information. He thought a great deal about him, I fancy, and would have run some risk to see him, and he told me once to ask the housekeeper whether he ever came into the village. She said he had only been twice, on horseback, accompanying his father, and both times he pretended to be quite knocked up for 3 or 4 days afterwards. That housekeeper left, if I recollect rightly, 2 years after she came, and another, whom I did not know, was her successor. She lives there still. Time wore on at the Grange in its former pleasant way, till Miss Cathy reached 16. On the anniversary of her birth we never manifested any signs of rejoicing, because it was also the anniversary of my late mistress's death. Her father invariably spent that day alone in the library, and walked, at dusk, as far as Gimmerton Kirkyard, where he would frequently prolong his stay beyond midnight. Therefore Catherine was thrown on her own resources for amusement. This 20th of March was a beautiful spring day, and when her father had retired, my young lady came down dressed for going out, and said she had asked to have a ramble on the edge of the moors with me, and Mr. Linton had given her leave, if we went only a short distance, and were back within the hour. "So make haste, Ellen," she cried. "I know where I wish to go, where a colony of moor game are settled. I want to see whether they have made their nests yet." "That must be a good distance up," I answered. "They don't breed on the edge of the moor." "No, it's not," she said. "I've gone very near with Papa." I put on my bonnet and sallied out, thinking nothing more of the matter. She bounded before me and returned to my side, and was off again like a young greyhound. And at first I found plenty of entertainment in listening to the larks singing far and near, and enjoying the sweet warm sunshine, and watching her, my pet and my delight, with her golden ringlets flying loose behind, and her bright cheek, as soft and pure in its bloom as a wild rose, and her eyes radiant with cloudless pleasure. She was a happy creature, and an angel in those days. It's a pity she could not be content. "Well," said I, "where are your moor game, Miss Cathy? We should be at them. The Grange Park fence is a great way off now." "Oh, a little further, only a little further, Ellen," was her answer, continually. "Climb to that hillock, pass that bank, and by the time you reach the other side, I shall have raised the birds." But there were so many hillocks and banks to climb and pass, that at length I began to be weary, and told her we must halt and retrace our steps. I shouted to her, as she had outstripped me a long way. She either did not hear or did not regard, for she still sprang on, and I was compelled to follow. Finally she dived into a hollow, and before I came in sight of her again, she was 2 miles nearer Wuthering Heights than her own home, and I beheld a couple of persons arrest her, one of whom I felt convinced was Mr. Heathcliff himself. Cathy had been caught in the act of plundering, or at least hunting out the nests of the grouse. The heights were Heathcliff's land, and he was reproving the poacher. "I've neither taken any nor found any," she said as I toiled to them, expanding her hands in corroboration of the statement. "I didn't mean to take them, but Papa told me there were quantities up here, and I wished to see the eggs." Heathcliff glanced at me with an ill-meaning smile, expressing his acquaintance with the party, and consequently his malevolence towards it, and demanded who Papa was. "Mr. Linton of Thrushcross Grange," she replied. "I thought you did not know me, or you wouldn't have spoken in that way." "You suppose Papa is highly esteemed and respected, then?" he said sarcastically. "And what are you?" inquired Catherine, gazing curiously on the speaker. "That man I've seen before, is he your son?" She pointed to Hareton, the other individual, who had gained nothing but increased bulk and strength by the addition of 2 years to his age. He seemed as awkward and rough as ever. "Miss Cathy," I interrupted, "it will be 3 hours instead of 1 that we are out presently. We really must go back." "No, that man is not my son," answered Heathcliff, pushing me aside. "But I have one, and you have seen him before, too. And though your nurse is in a hurry, I think both you and she would be the better for a little rest. Will you just turn this nab of heath and walk into my house? You'll get home earlier for the ease, and you shall receive a kind welcome." I whispered Catherine that she mustn't, on any account, accede to the proposal. It was entirely out of the question. Why? She asked aloud. I'm tired of running, and the ground is dewy. I can't sit here. Let us go, Ellen. Besides, he says I have seen his son. He's mistaken, I think, but I guess where he lives, at the farmhouse I visited in coming from Penistone Crags. Don't you? I do. I do. Come, Nellie, hold your tongue. It will be a treat for her to look in on us. Hareton, get forwards with the lass. You shall walk with me, Nellie. No, she's not going to any such place, I cried, struggling to release my arm, which he had seized. But she was almost at the door-stones already, scampering round the brow at full speed. Her appointed companion did not pretend to escort her. He shied off by the roadside and vanished. Mr. Heathcliff, it's very wrong, I continued. You know you mean no good. And there she'll see Linton, and all will be told as soon as ever we return, and I shall have the blame. I want her to see Linton, he answered. He's looking better these few days. It's not often he's fit to be seen, and will soon persuade her to keep the visit secret. Where's the harm of it? The harm of it is that her father would hate me if he found out I suffered her to enter your house, and I am convinced you have a bad design in encouraging her to do so, I replied. My design is as honest as possible. I'll inform you of its whole scope, he said, that the two cousins may fall in love and get married. I am acting generously to your master. His young chit has no expectations, and should she second my wishes, she'll be provided for at once as joint successor with Linton. If Linton died, I answered, and his life is quite uncertain, Catherine would be the heir. No, she would not, he said. There is no clause in the will to secure it so. His property would go to me. But to prevent disputes, I desire their union, and am resolved to bring it about. And I'm resolved she shall never approach your house with me again, I returned as we reached the gate, where Miss Cathy waited our coming. Heathcliff bid me be quiet, and preceding us up the path, hastened to open the door. My young lady gave him several looks, as if she could not exactly make up her mind what to think of him. But now he smiled when he met her eye, and softened his voice in addressing her, and I was foolish enough to imagine the memory of her mother might disarm him from desiring her injury. Linton stood on the hearth. He had been out walking in the fields, for his cap was on, and he was calling to Joseph to bring him dry shoes. He had grown tall of his age, still wanting some months of 16. His features were pretty yet, and his eye and complexion brighter than I remembered them, though with merely temporary luster borrowed from the salubrious air and genial sun. Now, who is that? Asked Mr. Heathcliff, turning to Cathy. Can you tell? Your son? She said, having doubtfully surveyed first one and then the other. Yes, answered he. But is this the only time you have beheld him? Think. Ah, you have a short memory. Linton, don't you recall your cousin that you used to tease us so with wishing to see? What? Linton? Cried Cathy, kindling into joyful surprise at the name. Is that little Linton? He's taller than I am. Are you Linton? The youth stepped forward and acknowledged himself. She kissed him fervently, and they gazed with wonder at the change time had wrought in the appearance of each. Catherine had reached her full height. Her figure was both plump and slender, elastic as steel, and her whole aspect sparkling with health and spirits. Linton's looks and movements were very languid, and his form extremely slight, but there was a grace in his manner that mitigated these defects and rendered him not unpleasing. After exchanging numerous marks of fondness with him, his cousin went to Mr. Heathcliff, who lingered by the door, dividing his attention between the objects inside and those that lay without, pretending, that is, to observe the latter, and really noting the former alone. And you are my uncle, then, she cried, reaching up to salute him. I thought I liked you, though you were cross at first. Why don't you live at the Grange with Linton? To live all these years such close neighbors and never see us is odd. What have you done so for? I visited it once or twice too often before you were born, he answered. There, damn it. If you have any kisses to spare, give them to Linton. They are thrown away on me. Naughty Ellen, exclaimed Catherine, flying to attack me next with her lavish caresses. Wicked Ellen, to try to hinder me from entering. But I'll take this walk every morning in my future. May I, uncle? And sometimes bring papa. Won't you be glad to see us? Of course, replied the uncle, with a hardly suppressed grimace, resulting from his deep aversion to both the proposed visitors. But stay, he continued, turning towards the young lady. Now I think of it, I'd better tell you. Mr. Linton has a prejudice against me. We quarreled at one time of our lives with unchristian ferocity, and if you mention coming here to him, he'll put a veto on your visits altogether. Therefore, you must not mention it, unless you be careless of seeing your cousin hereafter. You may come if you will, but you must not mention it. Why did you quarrel? Asked Catherine, considerably crestfallen. He thought me too poor to wed his sister, answered Heathcliff, and was grieved that I got her. His pride was hurt, and he'll never forgive it. That's wrong, said the young lady. Sometime I'll tell him so. But Linton and I have no share in your quarrel. I'll not come here then. He shall come to the Grange. It will be too far for me, murmured her cousin. To walk 4 miles would kill me. No, come here, Miss Catherine, now and then. Not every morning, but once or twice a week. The father launched toward his son a glance of bitter contempt. I am afraid, Nellie, I shall lose my labor, he muttered to me. Miss Catherine, as the ninny calls her, will discover his value and send him to the devil. Now, if it had been Hareton, do you know that 20 times a day I covet Hareton with all his degradation? I'd have loved the lad had he been someone else, but I think he's safe from her love. I'll pit him against that paltry creature unless it bestir itself briskly. We calculate it will scarcely last till it is 18. Oh, confound the vapid thing. He's absorbed in drying his feet and never looks at her. Linton! Yes, father, answered the boy. Have you nothing to show your cousin anywhere about? Not even a rabbit or a weasel's nest? Take her into the garden before you change your shoes, and into the stable to see your horse. Wouldn't you rather sit here? Asked Linton, addressing Cathy in a tone which expressed reluctance to move again. I don't know, she replied, casting a long look to the door and evidently eager to be active. He kept his seat and shrank closer to the fire. Heathcliff rose and went into the kitchen, and from thence to the yard, calling out for Hareton. Hareton responded, and presently the two re-entered. The young man had been washing himself, as was visible by the glow on his cheeks and his wetted hair. Oh, I'll ask you, uncle, cried Miss Cathy, recollecting the housekeeper's assertion. That is not my cousin, is he? Yes, he replied, your mother's nephew. Don't you like him? Catherine looked queer. Is he not a handsome lad? He continued. The uncivil little thing stood on tiptoe and whispered a sentence in Heathcliff's ear. He laughed. Hareton darkened. I perceived he was very sensitive to suspected slights and had obviously a dim notion of his inferiority. But his master or guardian chased the frown by exclaiming, You'll be the favorite among us, Hareton. She says you are a... what was it? Well, something very flattering. Here, you go with her round the farm, and behave like a gentleman, mind. Don't use any bad words, and don't stare when the young lady is not looking at you, and be ready to hide your face when she is. And when you speak, say your words slowly, and keep your hands out of your pockets. Be off, and entertain her as nicely as you can. He watched the couple walking past the window. Earnshaw had his countenance completely averted from his companion. He seemed studying the familiar landscape with a stranger's and an artist's interest. Catherine took a sly look at him, expressing small admiration. She then turned her attention to seeking out objects of amusement for herself and tripped merrily on, lilting a tune to supply the lack of conversation. I've tied his tongue, observed Heathcliff. He'll not venture a single syllable all the time. Nellie, you recollect me at that age. Nay, some years younger. Did I ever look so stupid, so gaumless, as Joseph calls it? Worse, I replied, because more sullen with it. I've a pleasure in him, he continued, reflecting aloud. He has satisfied my expectations. If he were a born fool, I should not enjoy it half so much. But he's no fool, and I can sympathize with all his feelings, having felt them myself. I know what he suffers now, for instance, exactly. It is merely a beginning of what he shall suffer, though, and he'll never be able to emerge from his bathos of coarseness and ignorance. I've got him faster than his scoundrel of a father secured me, and lower, for he takes a pride in his brutishness. I've taught him to scorn everything extra-animal as silly and weak. Don't you think Hindley would be proud of his son if he could see him? Almost as proud as I am of mine. But there's this difference. One is gold put to the use of paving stones, and the other is tin polished to ape a service of silver. Mine has nothing valuable about it, yet I shall have the merit of making it go as far as such poor stuff can go. His had first-rate qualities, and they are lost, rendered worse than unavailing. I have nothing to regret. He would have more than any, but I are aware of. And the best of it is, Hareton is damnably fond of me. You'll own that I've outmatched Hindley there. If the dead villain could rise from his grave to abuse me for his offspring's wrongs, I should have the fun of seeing the said offspring fight him back again, indignant that he should dare to rail at the one friend he has in the world. Heathcliff chuckled a fiendish laugh at the idea. I made no reply, because I saw that he expected none. Meantime, our young companion, who sat too removed from us to hear what was said, began to evince symptoms of uneasiness, probably repenting that he had denied himself the treat of Catherine's society for fear of a little fatigue. His father remarked the restless glances wandering to the window and the hand irresolutely extended towards his cap. "Get up, you idle boy," he exclaimed with assumed heartiness. "Away after them. They are just at the corner by the stand of hives." Linton gathered his energies and left the hearth. The lattice was open, and as he stepped out, I heard Cathy inquiring of her unsociable attendant what was that inscription over the door. Hareton stared up and scratched his head like a true clown. "It's some damnable writing," he answered. "I cannot read it." "Can't read it?" cried Catherine. "I can read it. It's English, but I want to know why it is there." Linton giggled, the first appearance of mirth he had exhibited. "He does not know his letters," he said to his cousin. "Could you believe in the existence of such a colossal dunce?" "Is he all as he should be?" asked Miss Cathy seriously. "Or is he simple, not right? I've questioned him twice now, and each time he looks so stupid I think he does not understand me. I can hardly understand him, I'm sure." Linton repeated his laugh and glanced at Hareton tauntingly, who certainly did not seem quite clear of comprehension at that moment. "There's nothing the matter but laziness, is there, Earnshaw?" he said. "My cousin fancies you are an idiot. There you experience the consequence of scorning book-larning, as you would say. Have you noticed, Catherine, his frightful Yorkshire pronunciation?" "Why, where the devil is the use on't?" growled Hareton, more ready in answering his daily companion. He was about to enlarge further, but the two youngsters broke into a noisy fit of merriment, my giddy miss being delighted to discover that she might turn his strange talk to matter of amusement. "Where is the use of the devil in that sentence?" tittered Linton. "Papa told you not to say any bad words, and you can't open your mouth without one. Do try to behave like a gentleman. Now do." If thou weren't more a lass than a lad, I'd fell thee this minute, I would. Pitiful lath of a cratur," retorted the angry boor, retreating, while his face burnt with mingled rage and mortification, for he was conscious of being insulted and embarrassed how to resent it. Mr. Heathcliff, having overheard the conversation, as well as I, smiled when he saw him go, but immediately afterwards cast a look of singular aversion on the flippant pair, who remained chattering in the doorway, the boy finding animation enough while discussing Hareton's faults and deficiencies and relating anecdotes of his goings-on, and the girl relishing his pert and spiteful sayings without considering the ill nature they evinced. But I began to dislike, more than to compassionate, Linton, and to excuse his father, in some measure, for holding him cheap. We stayed till afternoon. I could not tear Miss Cathy away before, but happily my master had not quitted his apartment and remained ignorant of our prolonged absence. As we walked home, I would fain have enlightened my charge on the characters of the people we had quitted, but she got it into her head that I was prejudiced against them. "Aha!" she cried. "You take Papa's side, Ellen. You are partial, I know, or else you wouldn't have cheated me of so many years into the notion that Linton lived a long way from here. I'm really extremely angry, only I'm so pleased I can't show it. But you must hold your tongue about my uncle. He's my uncle, remember, and I'll scold Papa for quarreling with him." And so she ran on, till I dropped endeavoring to convince her of her mistake. She did not mention the visit that night, because she did not see Mr. Linton. Next day it all came out, sadly to my chagrin, and still I was not altogether sorry. I thought the burden of directing and warning would be more efficiently borne by him than me, but he was too timid in giving satisfactory reasons for his wish that she would shun connection with the household of the Heights, and Catherine liked good reasons for every restraint that harassed her petted will. "Papa," she exclaimed after the morning salutations, "guess whom I saw yesterday in my walk on the moors?" "Ah, Papa, you started. You've not done right, have you now?" "I saw, but listen, and you shall hear how I found you out. And Ellen, who is in league with you, and yet pretended to pity me so, when I kept hoping and was always disappointed about Linton's coming back." She gave a faithful account of her excursion and its consequences, and my master, though he cast more than one reproachful look at me, said nothing till she had concluded. Then he drew her to him and asked if she knew why he had concealed Linton's near neighborhood from her. Could she think it was to deny her a pleasure that she might harmlessly enjoy? "It was because you disliked Mr. Heathcliff," she answered. "Then you believe I care more for my own feelings than yours, Cathy?" he said. "No, it was not because I disliked Mr. Heathcliff, but because Mr. Heathcliff dislikes me, and is a most diabolical man, delighting to wrong and ruin those he hates, if they give him the slightest opportunity. I knew that you could not keep up an acquaintance with your cousin without being brought into contact with him, and I knew he would detest you on my account. So for your own good, and nothing else, I took precautions that you should not see Linton again. I meant to explain this some time as you grew older, and I'm sorry I delayed it." "But Mr. Heathcliff was quite cordial, Papa," observed Catherine, not at all convinced, "and he didn't object to our seeing each other. He said I might come to his house when I pleased, only I must not tell you, because you had quarreled with him and would not forgive him for marrying Aunt Isabella. And you won't. You are the one to be blamed. He is willing to let us be friends, at least, Linton and I, and you are not." My master, perceiving that she would not take his word for her uncle-in-law's evil disposition, gave a hasty sketch of his conduct to Isabella and the manner in which Wuthering Heights became his property. He could not bear to discourse long upon the topic, for though he spoke little of it, he still felt the same horror and detestation of his ancient enemy that had occupied his heart ever since Mrs. Linton's death. She might have been living yet, if it had not been for him, was his constant bitter reflection, and in his eyes Heathcliff seemed a murderer. Miss Cathy, conversant with no bad deeds except her own slight acts of disobedience, injustice, and passion rising from hot temper and thoughtlessness, and repented of on the day they were committed, was amazed at the blackness of spirit that could brood on and cover revenge for years and deliberately prosecute its plans without a visitation of remorse. She appeared so deeply impressed and shocked at this new view of human nature, excluded from all her studies and all her ideas till now, that Mr. Edgar deemed it unnecessary to pursue the subject. He merely added, "You will know hereafter, darling, why I wish you to avoid his house and family. Now, return to your old employments and amusements, and think no more about them." Catherine kissed her father and sat down quietly to her lessons for a couple of hours, according to custom. Then she accompanied him into the grounds, and the whole day passed as usual. But in the evening, when she had retired to her room, and I went to help her to undress, I found her crying on her knees by the bedside. "Oh, fie, silly child," I exclaimed. "If you had any real griefs, you'd be ashamed to waste a tear on this little contrariety. You never had one shadow of substantial sorrow, Miss Catherine. Suppose for a minute that Master and I were dead, and you were by yourself in the world. How would you feel then? Compare the present occasion with such an affliction as that, and be thankful for the friends you have, instead of coveting more." "I'm not crying for myself, Ellen," she answered. "It's for him. He expected to see me again tomorrow, and there, he'll be so disappointed, and he'll wait for me, and I shan't come." "Nonsense," said I. "Do you imagine he has thought as much of you as you have of him? Hasn't he Hareton for a companion? Not 1 in 100 would weep at losing a relation they have just seen twice for 2 afternoons. Linton will conjecture how it is, and trouble himself no further about you." "But may I not write a note to tell him why I cannot come?" she asked, rising to her feet. "And just send these books I promised to lend him. His books are not as nice as mine, and he wanted to have them extremely when I told him how interesting they were. May I not, Ellen?" "No, indeed. No, indeed," replied I with decision. "Then he would write to you, and there'd never be an end of it. No, Miss Catherine, the acquaintance must be dropped entirely. So Papa expects, and I shall see that it is done." "But how can one little note," she recommenced, putting on an imploring countenance. "Silence," I interrupted. "We'll not begin with your little notes. Get into bed." She threw at me a very naughty look, so naughty that I would not kiss her good night at first. I covered her up and shut her door in great displeasure. But, repenting halfway, I returned softly, and lo! There was Miss, standing at the table with a bit of blank paper before her and a pencil in her hand, which she guiltily slipped out of sight on my re-entrance. "You'll get nobody to take that, Catherine," I said, "if you write it, and at present I shall put out your candle." I set the extinguisher on the flame, receiving as I did so a slap on my hand and a petulant, "Cross thing!" I then quitted her again, and she drew the bolt in one of her worst, most peevish humors. The letter was finished and forwarded to its destination by a milk fetcher who came from the village, but that I didn't learn till some time afterwards. Weeks passed on, and Cathy recovered her temper, though she grew wondrous fond of stealing off to corners by herself, and often, if I came near her suddenly while reading, she would start and bend over the book, evidently desirous to hide it, and I detected edges of loose paper sticking out beyond the leaves. She also got a trick of coming down early in the morning and lingering about the kitchen, as if she were expecting the arrival of something. And she had a small drawer in a cabinet in the library, which she would trifle over for hours, and whose key she took special care to remove when she left it. One day, as she inspected this drawer, I observed that the playthings and trinkets, which recently formed its contents, were transmuted into bits of folded paper. My curiosity and suspicions were roused. I determined to take a peep at her mysterious treasures, so at night, as soon as she and my master were safe upstairs, I searched and readily found among my house keys one that would fit the lock. Having opened, I emptied the whole contents into my apron and took them with me to examine at leisure in my own chamber. Though I could not but suspect, I was still surprised to discover that they were a mass of correspondence. Daily, almost, it must have been, from Linton Heathcliff, answers to documents forwarded by her. The earlier dated were embarrassed and short. Gradually, however, they expanded into copious love letters, foolish as the age of the writer rendered natural, yet with touches here and there which I thought were borrowed from a more experienced source. Some of them struck me as singularly odd compounds of ardor and flatness, commencing in strong feeling and concluding in the affected, wordy way that a schoolboy might use to a fancied, incorporeal sweetheart. Whether they satisfied Cathy, I don't know, but they appeared very worthless trash to me. After turning over as many as I thought proper, I tied them in a handkerchief and set them aside. relocking the vacant drawer. Following her habit, my young lady descended early and visited the kitchen. I watched her go to the door on the arrival of a certain little boy, and while the dairymaid filled his can, she tucked something in his jacket pocket and plucked something out. I went round by the garden and laid wait for the messenger, who fought valorously to defend his trust, and we split the milk between us. But I succeeded in abstracting his epistle, and threatening serious consequences if he did not look sharp home, I remained under the wall and perused Miss Cathy's affectionate composition. It was more simple and more eloquent than her cousin's, very pretty and very silly. I shook my head and went meditating into the house. The day being wet, she could not divert herself with rambling about the park, so at the conclusion of her morning studies, she resorted to the solace of the drawer. Her father sat reading at the table, and I, on purpose, had sought a bit of work in some unripped fringes of the window curtain, keeping my eyes steadily fixed on her proceedings. Never did any bird flying back to a plundered nest which it had left brimful of chirping young ones express more complete despair in its anguished cries and flutterings than she by her single "Oh!" and the change that transfigured her late happy countenance. Mr. Linton looked up. "What is the matter, love? Have you hurt yourself?" he said. His tone and look assured her he had not been the discoverer of the hoard. "No, Papa," she gasped. Excuse me. Ellen, come upstairs. I'm sick." I obeyed her summons and accompanied her out. "Oh, Ellen, you have got them," she commenced immediately, dropping on her knees when we were enclosed alone. "Oh, give them to me, and I'll never, never do so again. Don't tell Papa. You have not told Papa, Ellen. Say you have not. I've been exceedingly naughty, but I won't do it any more." With a grave severity in my manner, I bid her stand up. "So," I exclaimed, "Miss Catherine, you are tolerably far on, it seems. You may well be ashamed of them. A fine bundle of trash you study in your leisure hours, to be sure. Why, it's good enough to be printed. And what do you suppose the master will think when I display it before him? I haven't shown it yet, but you needn't imagine I shall keep your ridiculous secrets. For shame, and you must have led the way in writing such absurdities. He would not have thought of beginning, I am certain." I didn't, sobbed Cathy, fit to break her heart. "I didn't once think of loving him till—" "Loving?" cried I, as scornfully as I could utter the word. "Loving? Did anybody ever hear the like? I might just as well talk of loving the miller who comes once a year to buy our corn." "Pretty loving indeed. And both times together you have seen Linton hardly 4 hours in your life. Now, here is the babyish trash. I'm going with it to the library, and we'll see what your father says to such loving." She sprang at her precious epistles, but I held them above my head, and then she poured out further frantic entreaties that I would burn them, do anything rather than show them. And being really fully as inclined to laugh as scold, for I esteemed it all girlish vanity, I at length relented in a measure and asked, "If I consent to burn them, will you promise faithfully neither to send nor receive a letter again, nor a book, for I perceive you have sent him books, nor locks of hair, nor rings, nor playthings?" "We don't send playthings," cried Catherine, her pride overcoming her shame. "Not anything at all, then, my lady?" I said. "Unless you will, here I go." "I promise, Ellen," she cried, catching my dress. "Oh, put them in the fire, do." But when I proceeded to open a place with the poker, the sacrifice was too painful to be borne. She earnestly supplicated that I would spare her 1 or 2. 1 or 2, Ellen, to keep for Linton's sake?" I unknotted the handkerchief and commenced dropping them in from an angle, and the flame curled up the chimney. "I will have 1, you cruel wretch!" she screamed, darting her hand into the fire and drawing forth some half-consumed fragments at the expense of her fingers. "Very well, and I will have some to exhibit to Papa," I answered, shaking back the rest into the bundle and turning anew to the door. She emptied her blackened pieces into the flames and motioned me to finish the immolation. It was done. I stirred up the ashes and interred them under a shovelful of coals, and she mutely, and with a sense of intense injury, retired to her private apartment. I descended to tell my master that the young lady's qualm of sickness was almost gone, but I judged it best for her to lie down a while. She wouldn't dine, but she reappeared at tea, pale and red about the eyes, and marvelously subdued in outward aspect. Next morning, I answered the letter by a slip of paper inscribed, "Master Heathcliff is requested to send no more notes to Miss Linton, as she will not receive them." And thenceforth, the little boy came with vacant pockets. That concludes chapter 21. So we've seen Linton Heathcliff and Cathy/Catherine Linton establishing a friendship, possibly a romance. We do know that at some point they're going to end up married, but how that's going to happen, we still don't quite know. We have just a week and a half left of reading. Oh boy. So next week, a lot is going to happen. I will see you next week for more Read Aloud from Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. And just one last reminder, if you have not yet RSVP'd, is going to our tea party for the Count of Monte Cristo next Friday. Please do so right away so I have time to send you out your tea, your samples of tea, so we can drink all together next Friday. Thank you. And in the meantime, until then, I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next Monday for more reading. Bye, friends.